Tell by my attitude that I most definitely from.
All right, we're on to Unit 8, which is urbanization. We're going to look at location of cities today. First thing we have to start with is the difference between what rural and urban actually means. Rural means areas that are in the country that have less population density, so fewer people living in the area, and most jobs are in the primary sector like agriculture and logging. Urban means the region surrounding a city that is densely populated. Urban areas have lots of human structures like houses, commercial buildings, roads, bridges, railways, lots of built up area, lots of modification to the landscape. So if we looked at this little image here, we would see that the Bayside Boulevard is dividing the urban area from the rural area. What we think of an urban area, for example, downtown Milwaukee, is not always what urban actually means. It can mean suburban areas as well that are built up with very few primary activities taking place there. A lot of our suburban areas do have higher population densities than rural areas will have. If we look at the state of Wisconsin, most of our state is rural. The biggest urban area is the one in which we live in, which is Milwaukee. We also have urban activities taking place in Madison and Green Bay. Those are the three cities that would probably be considered the most urban of our state. Urban geography describes urban settlements in many different ways. So when we look at an urban settlement, we want to look at things like location. We want to look at the size of the urban area, and then also the distribution of the people within it. Some urban areas are very densely populated and some are not. We're looking at how land is used in these urban areas, and we are eventually going to also look at problems that are caused by all of these factors. Urban areas typically are large in size, have high population density, and also a very diverse group of people. Rural areas tend to have people that are more similar to each other, sort of like the difference between folk and pop culture that we have discussed already. If we look at the characteristics of a city, we are going to see that cities are central places. They are often melting pots for culture and different types of people. We will have places of exchange, meaning trade. We'll be trading products, materials, services, ideas even. They are places where we will store and supply items. A lot of early cities stored grain or different types of food that would then be sent off to other places. Cities are engines of change and centers of creativity. We see lots of vibrant new ideas coming out of cities. Cities influence places beyond their borders. So the city of Milwaukee is going to influence a large amount of people outside of the city of Milwaukee as well. And then also cities will be connected to other cities. For example, the city of Milwaukee is very closely connected to the city of Chicago. In order to talk about where cities are located, let's first talk about the first cities in the world. The first cities are in Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East, more than 5,000 years ago. Cities were made possible because of farming, and that of course led to job specialization. People became potters and weavers and merchants. For example, here's a depiction of Egyptian jobs and the different levels that a person could be on in their social structure. We've already sort of looked at this, but we had agriculture leading to cities. First, hunter-gatherers were roaming around the earth. Then humans started to farm. People then started to transform their environments around them. With the extra food that agriculture provided people, it allowed others to learn new crafts and skills. Those people tended to cluster in cities and towns. And finally, trade and diffusion increased as a result of farming. If we look at some of the locations of the first cities in the world, if we look at the Fertile Crescent, we will see that there are fresh water sources. They're also located in very strategic areas. If we look at the Indus River Valley civilization, which is in present-day Pakistan, we can also see a lot of similarities with the Fertile Crescent. So people chose to put their cities in very specific locations. There are many variables that affect where cities are located. These can be summarized by site and situation factors. We're going to look at each. Alright, first we're going to start with site. Site is the physical character of a place or the conditions that are right there at the location. What is it like right at the spot where the city is located? Site factors are very important, and what makes a good site varies amongst different cultures. Some people are looking for different factors, whether it be self-defense or whether it be good supplies, flat land to build on, those kinds of things. And humans can also modify the characteristics of a site. So site can change. We can try to improve a site for our uses. For example, if we look at Manhattan Island, originally at this red line here is where the original Manhattan Island was. And over time, as you can see, each line corresponds to a year in the key here. Dirt was dumped and the island of Manhattan was actually expanded. This whole area between the yellow and blue line was created from the World Trade Center site. When they dug out the ground to build the foundation for the World Trade Center, they dumped the dirt here at Battery Park and then increased the size of Manhattan Island. Here's a list of factors that can affect site. Is the land flat? What's the climate like? We know that people like to live in that Goldilocks zone between too hot and too cold. Is there fresh water available? What is the soil quality like? So can we grow plants that are going to support our city? What type of buildings do we like to build? Are there building materials nearby that can help us make those buildings? And those are all things that are affected by site. If we look at cities in a climate map, we can see very clearly that most of the world's cities are going to be in these mid-latitude areas, either just slightly north or south of the equator. We can use defensive sites. Here's a couple examples. Places that are easy to defend, things that are on hills, cities on hills, or sheltered harbors, or peninsulas are easy to defend. For example, a city in France that is clearly easy to defend. We can also have sites that are favoring trade, places where two rivers meet, which is called a confluence, or a place where you're going to start navigation from or end navigation down a river. A portage site, which would be where you would take your boat out of the water and carry it to the next river. In between there is often a very good site for trade. The other factor that we have to take into consideration is situation. Situation is the connections that a place has to other areas around it. Situation factors explain why a place is important to the area surrounding it. Many places are actually important, and we build cities on them because they are accessible or help us connect ourselves to other places. Sometimes site factors aren't as important as situation factors. It could also be the reverse, and sometimes we will prefer a site even if it has a bad situation. It all depends on pros and cons of that specific place. Let's look at some examples of situation factors. Having resources nearby is really important for building, for trade, and so some cities will be built near resource areas. Other situation factors include being located near major transportation routes and trade routes, being a fair distance away from enemies so that they're easy to defend, being near other towns that are also important. It could be even things as simple as wind patterns. For example, you do not want to be downwind from a swamp because it will smell. Oftentimes, roads, phone lines, train lines also help connect cities to other cities. If we look at site and situation as a horizontal and vertical axis, we can look at site being the vertical axis, that you will have the very specific conditions of what it is like in that exact spot, whereas situation would be the horizontal axis, where you are looking at connections to regional and global cities around you. Let's use the nearby city of Chicago as an example of site and situation.
My kind of town, Chicago is. My kind of town, Chicago.
In the mid-19th century, the 1800s, Chicago and St. Louis were competing for the title of most important city of the West. Obviously, St. Louis and Chicago have very different site and situation factors, and Chicago is going to end up winning that struggle. So why Chicago? Chicago was seen as a swampland that only white man would want to live in by the Native Americans that populated northern Illinois. Chicago actually means place of the wild onion or smelling place by the river in Potawatomi. So Chicago had a very poor site. It was only about 2 feet above the river level, so the site was poor. The situation was fantastic, and so they decided to raise the level of the streets and buildings, which required a lot of human effort to do. So let's look at the situation and why they decided that this was a good place to build a city. First of all, rail lines created a pattern. West of Chicago, they formed radial lines, almost like a funnel leading into Chicago. And east of Chicago, they formed a trunk line, which went straight to New York City. So it was a very convenient rail location that connected the east to the west. Next, it had a lot of resources nearby. Things like furs, fertile soil near ranches in the Great Plains, the lumber of Wisconsin and Michigan, the iron ore of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and coal from southern Illinois. So it was a central location between all of those resources. That is a great situation. Those resources ended up leading to very important industries like steel, meatpacking, railroad industry, including building train cars, farm equipment, banking, and stock and mercantile exchange. The banking and the stock exchange were a result of trading some of these resources. Site and situation often work together. Sometimes situation is more important, sometimes site is more important. At any point in history, a culture may see a site as having advantages and disadvantages. For example, it may present a threat or opportunity. A place might be easy to capitalize based on current technology. And oftentimes, the potential of a city is based on its ability to interact with other cities and connect to them or its situation.
I love it. Bet your bottom dollar you lose the blues in Chicago, Chicago.